Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This video is video 3 in our series on flying RNAV GPS approaches. In this video, we'll demonstrate how to fly an LPV RNAV GPS approach using the Garmin GNS 530 and 430 equipped Cessna 172. In video 1 of this series, we cover the basics of RNAV GPS approaches. We discussed what they are, how they're designed, and talked about the different types of RNAV GPS approaches that are available. If you haven't watched that video, I'd recommend doing so before watching this one, and I'll leave a link to that video in this video's description. It's also a good idea to be familiar with the basics of instrument flying and the basics of instrument approach procedures before viewing this video. And I'll leave links to those videos in this video's description as well. If you're not familiar with the operation of the Garmin GNS 530 and 430, it's a good idea to get familiar with that as well, specifically the working title version that we'll be using in this video. And I'll leave a link to the playlist for that training series in this video's description also. I'll also mention that we will be using the exact same approach that we used to demonstrate the LPV approach in the Garmin G1000. So if you've watched that video, things like the approach briefing on this video are going to be repeats. So you can go ahead and skip past those segments to the specific segments that are applicable to the GNS 530 and 430. Before we get in the airplane, let's do a quick review of what an LPV approach is. An LPV approach is a type of RNAV GPS approach which gives you approved lateral and vertical guidance during the approach. LPV stands for Localizer Performance with Vertical Navigation. With LP lateral guidance, the course width narrows as you get closer to the runway. It starts at a width of 1 nautical mile when you're in the terminal area, which is any time you're within 30 nautical miles of the departure or destination airport. It narrows down to 0.3 nautical miles either side of the course when you get within 2 nautical miles of the final approach fix. At the final approach fix, it gradually narrows to only 700 feet wide at the runway threshold. This mimics the sort of sensitivity you would get when flying an ILS localizer, hence the term localizer performance. Since you get very precise lateral guidance to the runway, as well as a GPS-generated glide path, this makes it very similar to the guidance you get on an ILS approach. So you basically fly it in the same way that you would fly an ILS approach, following the lateral and vertical guidance from the GPS down to a decision height, where you either get the runway in sight and proceed to a visual landing, or you don't and execute the missed approach. With this precise lateral and vertical guidance all the way to the runway threshold, LPV approaches usually have minimums very similar to that of an ILS, with a decision height as low as 200 feet and visibility as low as 1,800 RVR or 1/2 statute mile, depending on the runway and approach lighting system available. Like an ILS approach, you can fly this approach by coupling it to the autopilot and/or flight director or hand fly it using raw data. To demonstrate flying the approach, we'll conduct a short IFR flight from Pine Bluff Grider Field in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. The identifier for that airport is Kilo Papa Bravo Foxtrot, to Stuttgart Airport in Stuttgart, Arkansas. The identifier there is Kilo Sierra Golf Tango. We'll plan to fly the LPV RNAV GPS approach to runway 36 at Stuttgart. After departing Pine Bluff, we'll navigate direct to Hokum Waypoint, which serves as both an initial and intermediate approach fix for this approach. We'll assume that we request and get clearance to fly the approach straight in without flying the procedure turn at Hokum, using it as an intermediate approach fix. Our filed route will be Pine Bluff, direct to Hokum, direct to Stuttgart, though in real life you could likely just file direct from airport to airport and then request direct to Hokum once you get airborne off of Pine Bluff. We'll file for an altitude of 3,000 feet for this northeast-bound flight, and this will keep us above the off-route obstruction clearance altitude between these two airports, as well as above the MSA and all procedure altitudes on the approach. The flight is just over 31 track miles, which should take us about 15 minutes to fly in the Cessna 172. We'll plan to depart runway 36 at Pine Bluff. We've checked the takeoff and departure procedures for Pine Bluff. There are takeoff obstacle notes, but there are no special departure procedures and no takeoff minimums. So we know that we'll be safe using the standard diverse departure procedure of flying runway heading to 400 feet AGL before we make a turn on course. We'll assume that the weather at Pine Bluff Airport is good enough that we can get back in and that we feel comfortable departing. The weather at Stuttgart is reported as calm winds, 1 mile visibility, ceiling of 300 overcast, temperature and dew point of 15 degrees C, and an altimeter of 2992. We'll assume that we filed an alternate for the flight and that it is a legal alternate. We'll also say that there is a NOTAM for the approach lights to runway 36 being out of service since they appear to be missing in Microsoft Flight Simulator. All right, so let's take an in-depth look at the approach and the approach plate to make sure that we are familiar with all the information that we need to know to fly this approach. Over the top right-hand corner, it gives the title of the procedure. It is the RNAV GPS to runway 36, and it is for Stuttgart Municipal Carl Humphrey Field in Stuttgart, Arkansas. It's got the identifier, the FAA identifier there of SGT, and the top left, it tells us that this is in Stuttgart, Arkansas, is where the airfield is located. Top left of the briefing strip here, it gives us some wash channel information. I think they just stick this on here because on like a ILS approach or something with a ground-based nav aid, this is where you put the frequency for that type of approach, so they felt like they needed to put something in here. There's not really anything that we can do with this as a pilot. It's not like we can change the wash channel, so it's just there for informational purposes only. There's not really much we can do with that. It does give us the inbound approach course. It is 360, and we can see that is duplicated on the plan view down here. Then it gives us some runway information for runway 36, tells us the runway landing length is 6,015 feet. Tells us that the touchdown zone elevation for runway 36 is 224 feet MSL, and that the airport elevation is also 224 feet MSL. Underneath that, we have a little remark that says RNP approach, which just tells us that this is an approach that has a certain navigation standard. Until we get to the final approach fix, we need to have an accuracy of 0.3 nautical miles, or actually as we get to the final approach fix, and then of course with the LPV approach, it's going to narrow down from there. Under that, we have the little T that tells us that this has something unusual about the departure. This means that it has obstacle departure notes, or it has non-standard takeoff minimums, or it has an obstacle departure procedure. None of that is really applicable to us as an arrival, but just something we need to be aware of when we depart back out of here. And then the A means that it has a non-standard minimums for filing this airport as an alternate. So if we're going to file this airport an alternate, we want to take a look at that and see what changed there. Then we have the notes section. Most of this does not apply to us. It says when using local altimeter setting, or when the local altimeter setting is not received, and has some notes about what you need to do to the minimums. If that is the case, we are going to get the local altimeter setting, so that is not an issue. It says for an inoperative approach lighting system, when using Little Rock Airport altimeter settings, we have to do some adjustments to the minimums. But even though we have the inoperative approach lighting system here, we don't have to do this because we are not using the Little Rock altimeter settings, so that is not applicable here. We have the type of approach lighting system that it has. This is a medium intensity approach lighting system with sequence flashing lights, so it's got the rabbits and the white T, but again, it's missing in Flight Simulator, so we're going to have to do some adjustments to our minimums for that approach lighting system being not present or inoperative in Flight Simulator. It's got our missed approach instructions down here. It tells us in the event of a missed approach, we're going to climb straight ahead to 2000, go direct to Zedek, and then hold. And you can see that's what's depicted on the plan view here. It's got the holding pattern at Zedek. And then we also have in the profile view, we've also got the same directions here, straight ahead to 2000 and go to Zedek. Underneath that, it does have the frequencies that we're going to use and the order that we're going to use them. It does have automated weather so that we can tune in and listen to the weather. Then we would be talking to Little Rock Approach when we are on The approach, it has the clearance delivery frequency for once we get on the ground, and the Unicon that we'll talk to make, and the common traffic advisory frequency that we would use to make our traffic calls once we are handed off from approach to the common traffic advisory frequency. So looking at the plan view of the chart, up in the top right corner, we do have a MSA, or a minimum safe altitude, listed on the approach. This is based on the waypoint for runway 36 there at Stuttgart, and it says as long as you're within 25 nautical miles of that fix, then you know this MSA will be applicable. MSA is 2,500 feet, and again, all this MSA tells us is that if we are within this distance, then we can get down to this altitude and still have our legal minimum IFR obstacle clearance of 1,000 feet above all obstacles in this sector. Again, this is not a procedure altitude, meaning that we can't descend down to this altitude, say once we're within 25 nautical miles of runway 36 in the real world. We do need clearance from ATC to descend down to that altitude, unlike a terminal arrival area, which you see on a lot of GPS approaches nowadays, where you could actually descend down to that altitude. That's actually a procedure altitude. You can use it in Flight Simulator if you're not using ATC to assume that you get clearance once you're in this sector to go ahead and descend down to this altitude. Just like any other approach blade, it does depict the water here. So we do have a river over here and a couple of lakes depicted here. We do have the tallest obstacle over here, 1,424 feet MSL. So that's where that's located and the height that it's located at. And then we have a couple of different other obstacles that are closer to the airport. So it's got those depicted and has those marked as to how high those are. So looking at the procedure itself, we do have a feeder route coming in from Pine Bluff VOR. We are not going to utilize that. We'll navigate direct to Hogum instead and use that as an intermediate affix. But if you were to take the route from Pine Bluff VOR, all you do is load it up in the GPS. You navigate direct to Pine Bluff VOR, and then it tells you that the MEA on this route from Pine Bluff, and it looks like it's pointing at Okoyu. Initial approach fix is the 2,000 feet. It's a 049 course, and it's 15.2 nautical miles long. And if you flew that, you'd fly from there into Okoyu, and then you would go from Okoyu to Hogum, and then on the approach there. It does tell you that Okoyu is an initial approach fix, and that it has a 2,000 foot procedure altitude, so you could descend if you're cleared for the approach down to 2,000 feet once you hit Okoyu, and you do not have to do the procedure turn. It does say no PT on a 090 course, and the length of that segment is 5 miles long. We do have two of these initial approach fix. You can use Okoyu if you're coming in from the northwest. You can use Kyle if you're coming in from the northeast. And you would just hit the fix and then proceed in on the course. Again, it says no PT on these two outboard initial approach fixes. And gives you a procedure altitude. And then you go from the initial approach fix to Hogum and then in on the approach from there. We will be using Hogum. We'll be navigating direct to Hogum. We will use it as an intermediate fix. You can see it's labeled IF/IAF, which means it's both an intermediate fix and an initial approach fix. If we navigated to it as the initial approach fix, we would need to do this holding pattern in lieu of the procedure turn. But it is legal if you're approaching the intermediate fix within 90 degrees to use that as your starting fix for the approach and not to have to do the procedure turn if you're cleared to do so by ATC. So we'll assume that we are going to get that clearance, and we'll just navigate direct to Hogum and then on in on the approach from there. You'll notice once you get to Hogum, you have the segment from Hogum to Laus, which is the final approach fix, or FAF. That we have a course of 360. We have a procedure altitude of 1,900 feet. So if you are established on that segment, you can go ahead and clear for the approach. You can go ahead and descend down to 1,900 feet. And then that segment is 6 miles long. We do have not an intermediate fix. We have a kind of a step down fix of Marv, which is 3 nautical miles from the runway. This is only used if you're flying the LNAV procedure. It's not going to be applicable for the LPV approach. And then we have a waypoint right at the runway threshold that's designated RW36, and that is, if we were to shoot the LNAV approach, that would be our missed approach point. But we are shooting an LPV, so our missed approach point is going to be our arrival at our decision altitude. Looking at our profile view down here, you can see that as we approach Hogum, if we're on course or in that holding pattern, we have a platform altitude of 2,000 feet until we get to Hogum. Once we hit Hogum, we can descend down to 1,900 feet, and then the lightning bolt arrow there indicates that that's where we'll intercept the glide path. And so we'll intercept the glide path and ride that down to our decision altitude. It does list a step down altitude at Marv intersection, but it tells us that that is only applicable, if we look at the asterisk here, if we're shooting the LNAV approach, not the LPV. And then we also have a visual descent point that is only applicable to shooting the LNAV approach. And then here is our RW36 waypoint at the runway threshold. And again, it gives the distances between each of these fixes. So from Hogum down to Laus, it's 6 nautical miles. It's 2 nautical miles from Laus to Marv, 1.9 to the visual descent point, which won't be on our GPS. We'll see 3 miles once we pass Marv. And then it's 1.1 from the visual descent point to the runway threshold. The LPV minimums, you can see it tells you that it is a decision altitude and not an MDA. So we have a decision altitude of 474 feet, which is 250 feet above the ground. And then our visibility required is 3/4 mile to shoot this approach. But again, with the approach lighting system being inoperative, we're going to have to make an adjustment to that, which we'll talk about in a second. The approach minimums are the same for all categories of aircraft. We are category A, but it doesn't matter if you're a B, C, or D. The minimums for the LPV approach are all the same. And taking a look at the data that is on the airport diagram, it gives the airport elevation again, it gives the touchdown zone elevation again, gives us a runway diagram with the length and width of all the different runways, shows us where the rotating beacon is, shows us where the approach comes in from, so it's not exactly aligned with runway 36 here, but it is coming in pretty much straight in. It does show us the approach lighting system, which again is missing in Flight Simulator, so we'll have to consider that inoperative. And then it tells us that the medium intensity runway lighting on 1836 and 927 is pilot controlled in the real world, as are the runway end identifier lights, which is 2 strobes on either side of the runway. For both runway 18 and 27, those are also pilot controlled. As we mentioned earlier, the approach lighting system in Flight Simulator for this airport, for this runway, is missing. It is not being depicted, so we will consider it inoperative. And anytime you have an inoperative approach lighting system, you want to go to this inoperative components table that tells you how to adjust your minimums. And this is located in the front of every terminal procedures publication that is published by the FAA, so you can find it on the FAA website, but you can also Google it. Just make sure that you're looking at the approach, the inoperative components table that looks like this. They did revise it recently to bring it up to date with, the newer approach types that they have with LPVs and LNAVs, and kind of simplify it as to, it used to be kind of different depending on what approach lighting system it was. They've simplified that for precision approaches now, so it's just one adjustment for all approach lighting types. So we want to take a look at this top line here. It says for any ILS, PRL, PAR, LPV, or GLS approach, we are shooting an LPV approach. This is what we need to do to adjust our minimums. It says for any approach lighting system except for omnidirectional approach lighting system, that if your approach lighting system is inoperative, you need to increase your visibility by 1/4 mile. So if we look here, we have a 3/4 mile visibility minimum here. We need to increase that by 1/4 mile, and that brings our visibility minimum up to 1 mile that's required to shoot the approach. So that is our new visibility minimum for shooting this approach with the approach lighting system inoperative. As far as autopilot operations in this aircraft go, we only have two options. We can have the autopilot on or we can have the autopilot off. There is no option to fly this approach with just the flight director without the autopilot on. There is no flight director in this aircraft, so you don't have that option. I will say that I will be demonstrating this approach with the autopilot on, and I would say that in real life, most pilots tend to lean towards flying that way in actual instrument conditions unless they're engaging in training or trying to maintain their instrument flying proficiency. It's just the safer way to go. But if you do want to hand fly it, if you are used to flying something like an ILS, hand flying that, then there's no reason you can't just turn off the autopilot and try to fly this, hand fly this. Those two approaches fly basically the same. I do make the recommendation for folks that are not, proficient in instrument flying or new to instrument flying, and you haven't flown many instrument approaches yet and you don't feel quite comfortable hand flying them, then do try to fly it with the automation first, with that autopilot engaged. That way all you have to worry about is configuration and throttle. And then once you watch the autopilot fly a couple of approaches, then go ahead and kick off the autopilot and try to hand fly it. The approach flies exactly the same as an ILS. You just follow the lateral and vertical guidance, and that will take you down to the decision altitude, down to the runway. As far as the autopilot goes, all you need to do to fly the approach is arm the approach. You can arm nav to track the lateral portion of the navigational guidance, and then you can arm the approach mode, and that will arm the glide path tracking, the GPS glide path tracking, just like it would track an ILS glide slope, as long as you have your nav radio set up to display GPS course guidance. And that's all you need to do on this particular autopilot to be able to fly this approach using the autopilot. If you're not familiar with the autopilot in the Cessna 172 Classic, I do have a separate video that does a deep dive on that, so make sure to check that out, and I'll leave a link to that video in this video's description. So looking at the techniques we're going to use to fly this approach specifically with the Cessna 172, again, we'll take off from Pine Bluff, and once we get to about 400 feet AGL, we will have already loaded the approach on the ground. So we'll go ahead and send it direct to Hogum intersection. We'll climb up to 3,000 feet. So we'll just be navigating in this direction to Hogum intersection, and we will have loaded the approach so it does not have the procedure turn. We'll talk about how to do that as soon as we hop in the aircraft here. Once we get within about 10 nautical miles, we'll assume that ATC is going to clear us down to 2,500 feet and clear us for the approach. So we'll go ahead and descend to 2,500 feet and continue to navigate into Hogum. Once we get to Hogum, the aircraft will start sequencing onto the next segment here and start flying towards Laos. We have been cleared for the approach, so at that point we can go ahead and descend down to 1,900 feet. And once we get to 1,900 feet, we level off. Then we'll start preparing to configure for the approach. We will be using the low speed technique for flying approaches with vertical navigation. So we're going to level at 1,900 feet. Once we get about 3 miles from Laos, then we'll go ahead and configure and get on our approach speed. Then we'll intercept the glide path and fly the approach on in. We fly that approach, follow that vertical and lateral guidance down to our decision height of 474 feet. So a little bit before 474, we'll take a look up. With the weather set the way that we're going to set it, we should be able to see the runway at that point, and we'll go ahead and continue to a visual landing from there. But if you got to 474, you look up and you don't see anything, that's the time to go ahead and execute the missed approach procedure. Again, the missed approach procedure is just to fly straight ahead to 2,000, fly to Zedek. One thing that is a little different about flying a missed approach in the G1000 or the GNS 530-430 is when you get to the runway 36 waypoint, it will go into suspension mode. So you will have to hit that OBS button to get it out of suspension mode and get it to navigating to Zedek. But other than that, it flies just like a normal missed approach. So let's talk a little bit about how the GPS is going to sequence through the waypoints as we navigate towards Hogum. As we pass over each fix, it will sequence to the next fix until we get down to the RW 36 or runway 36 waypoint, and then it will go into a suspension mode, and that assumes that you're landing. If you actually need to go missed approach, then you'll want to hit the OBS button. That will take it out of suspend mode and allow it to sequence out to ZEDEC and to the missed approach procedure. So as you fly over Hogum, it will sequence into Laos. As you fly over Laos, it will sequence over to Marv, and as you fly over Marv, it will sequence to runway 36 or RW36. And again, once you hit RW36, then it will go into suspend. And if you need to sequence out to the missed approach point, you need to hit that OBS button to get it out there. As far as your vertical guidance, you will receive no vertical guidance until you pass Hogum. And then once you pass Hogum, you'll see that the vertical course information will come alive, the flag will disappear, and that will come alive, allowing you to intercept that glide path at Laos. You can leave it in nav mode if you're using the autopilot until you get to Hogum, and then once you pass Hogum, you can go ahead and arm the approach mode, and that will enable the autopilot to track the glide path. And then as far as the sequencing is not going to affect how the course information is displayed or how the autopilot follows the course information. You'll just notice as you come through the approach how it sequences between the different waypoints. But the glide path and the lateral nav track should remain steady and allow you to follow those. I'll also mention that the correct procedure for setting the CDI is to set it to your inbound approach course. But when you are in GPS mode on the nav radios or the nav displays, how you set the CDI is not going to affect in any way how the course information is displayed. It doesn't matter what you do with the CDI. The course information will display accurately no matter what you do with it. So again, good practice is to set it in the inbound course just to remind yourself of what that course heading is. Or what that approach course is, but it's not strictly necessary as far as it's not going to affect how the GPS operates at all. The other thing that I'll mention is that in Flight Simulator, you'll notice that the courses that are on the approach plate and the desired track you show for a particular course on the approach may not match up exactly. It may be just a few degrees off. This is a simism. I think it has to do with probably the magnetic variation that's in the sim versus what is in real life. I noticed that the VOR radials are off just slightly as well. So it's not something you need to do anything about. You'll just notice that it's a little bit different, maybe a couple degrees off. In real life, if you had a significant difference between your approach course and what the course shows on the GPS, you'd want to probably discontinue the approach and try to figure out what's going on there and make sure that your GPS is giving you accurate position information and accurate course information. But just be aware that in Flight Simulator, it will be off by a couple of degrees and you can go ahead and fly it. You will wind up in the right place. So looking at the way we're going to fly the final segment of the approach, again, we're going to use the low speed technique. So once we get about 3 miles from the glide path intercept, which will be 3.0 distance from Laos intersection on the GPS, then we're going to go ahead and configure for our approach. We'll go ahead and bring the power to 1800 RPM. We'll hold our altitude and allow the aircraft to slow. We should already be below 110 knots, but if we're not, we'll let it slow to below 110 knots and we'll put the flaps out to 10. Once we're below 85 knots, we'll go ahead and bring the flaps one notch at a time down to 30 degrees. And then once you are at about 75 knots is when you want to bring the power back in. Then you'll increase that power up to about 2200 to 2400 RPM. And if you do it at 75 knots, once you get to 2400 RPM, that should get you stabilized in level flight at 70 knots. And we use 70 knots as the approach speed. So you want to lead that application of power just a little bit, about 5 knots. Once you're stabilized and in level flight at 70 knots, you should have a mile or two before you hit the glide slope intercept or the glide path intercept. You want to go ahead and accomplish your before landing checklist at this point. And you want to go ahead and do what you're going to do with the autopilot and the flight director. If you want to fly it with raw data or you want to fly it with the autopilot off, this is a good time to go ahead and kick those things off. Once you intercept the glide path, and you're going to go ahead and reduce your power. 1800 to 2000 RPMs should get you the descent rate that you want. Again, you're going to want probably about 400 feet per minute plus or minus to track that glide path. Then make small changes in pitch and power and heading to track the lateral guidance and the glide path. Again, just like flying an ILS, make very small corrections left and right and very small changes in your descent rate to keep that lateral guidance and the glide path centered up. So track the guidance and the glide path down to that decision altitude of 474. Once you get to the decision altitude, you'll either transition to a visual landing, or once the required visual cues are in sight, or you'll execute the missed approach when it's appropriate. And just a little reminder about when should you go missed approach on a approach with vertical guidance. If you do not have the required visual references in sight when you get to decision altitude, then you need to go ahead and go missed approach. If the required visual references are lost after you've descended below decision altitude, so you've gone below the decision altitude, you had everything in sight, but then you go into a fog bank or whatever and you lose it again, you also need to go missed approach at that point. Anytime you get a full-scale deviation on the lateral or vertical guidance without the runway environment in sight, then you need to go missed approach. And again, on a check ride, you're only allowed a 3/4 scale deflection on the lateral or vertical guidance before you need to go missed approach. If you go beyond 3/4 scale deviation on a check ride, that is considered a bust if you don't go missed approach. If the approach becomes unstabilized, if your descent rate becomes too high, your airspeed becomes too fast, then you need to go ahead and execute that missed approach. And if any required component of the approach or onboard equipment becomes inoperative, there's really nothing that can go inoperative other than the GPS. But if suddenly you get, if your LPV annunciation disappears, you're no longer in approach mode, then you need to go missed. Or if you get an integrity warning on the GPS, then you need to go missed. And then anytime it becomes unsafe for any reason to continue the approach, in your opinion, then you need to go ahead and execute that missed approach. That can be anything from weather, bad weather, wind shear, something like that at the airport, to something like, an aircraft pulling out on the runway, or you're uncertain of an aircraft's position on the airport, or a vehicle or something is pulled out on the runway. All right, so to set up for the flight, we will go from the world map, and we'll mark our way from the top left across to the right and then down like we usually do. So for the aircraft selection, you want the Cessna 172, Textron Aviation Cessna 172 Skyhawk. You don't need to see Arista Blue there. That is just a third-party livery that I have. You do not want to see, however, the Cessna 172 Skyhawk G1000. You do want this just plain Cessna 172 Skyhawk. And again, this is only available in the deluxe edition. You will not see it if you have the standard edition. You won't be able to fly in the 172 using the GNS 530 and 430 liveries. You can do whatever you want with. The weight and balance, I go ahead and bring it to 2 full tanks of gas, the two 170-pound occupants, and then failures and customization. You can do whatever you'd like to do there. And then airport departure, we'll just put in our departure airport. We won't load a flight plan, so Kilo, Papa, Bravo, Foxtrot, there we go, Pine Bluff, Grider Field, and you can choose to depart from the ramp or depart from runway 36. Either one is just fine. As far as flight conditions, we will set it up so that it is the middle of June, and then we will set the weather in the actual session, and then we will set it up for about noon on the time, and we set that time on the bottom left-hand corner here. So that is all you need to do to set up for the flight. Again, we'll set up the weather once we're in the session and we are ready to go ahead and fly. All right, so as far as setting up the weather, we'll start with the right side here first. We want the altitude calculation at AMSL, above mean sea level. so the cloud bases are even. Precipitation, I would recommend setting this at 0 so that you don't have any additional restrictions to visibility other than the cloud cover. Snow depth and lightning you really don't need. And then temperature I've set at 61-ish. And that should be about 15 degrees at the surface in both Pine Bluff and Stuttgart with a standard barometric pressure of 2992 or 1013 if you're setting it at millibars. And I set the humidity at 1, which is the lowest setting, again, just so you don't have any further restrictions on visibility other than what you're imposing with the cloud cover. I recommend having the 2 top layers. You're not going to be able to break out the top the way we have it set here, so have those 2 top layers just set at 0 or clear coverage. And then with this bottom layer, what we'll do is set it to overcast, 100%. Density will be at 0.5, and this is again for visibility so that we can see the runway from the decision height. Scatter, it really doesn't matter what you do with the scatter with a overcast cloud coverage, but I do have it set it to 0. And then I have the altitude top set up around 11,000 feet, and that should get it so that you're not going to break out on top. And the altitude bottom is set at negative 500 feet, which is roughly 1,000 feet underneath our minimums for the approach, and that's about what you need to break out just a little bit above minimum. So that's how we have the weather set up. Now let's jump into the cockpit and talk about setting up the avionics for our approach. So once we get the avionics powered up, we'll go ahead and call Little Rock Departure for our IFR clearance. They do have a remote communications outlet, a transmitter here on the ground in Pine Bluff, through which we can talk to them and get our clearance. So we'll talk to them. And so we'll call up and say, Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, we're looking for IFR to Stuttgart. They call back and they say, Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, cleared to Stuttgart as filed. On departure, fly runway heading. Climb maintain 3,000 feet. Departure frequency 119.85, squawk 5502. We call back and read all that back, and then they likely call back and either give us a clearance void time, or they tell us to call them when we are number 1 for departure to get our IFR release. And so we copy all that, and now we'll go ahead and set up the avionics. All right, so now that we've got our clearance, let's go ahead and set up our avionics. There are basically 3 ways that you can load this approach. It's all through the procedure page, but there's 3 kind of different ways that you can get the right airport in the procedure page. The first is to create a flight plan between Pine Bluff and Stuttgart, just those 2 points in the flight plan page. The next is to go direct to Stuttgart using the direct key with nothing in the flight plan. And then the final one is just to go to the procedure page and load the airport. Flight Sim does have an error that looks like it's been introduced in Sim Update 13, to where if you don't utilize the flight plan method, you will get a nav flag on the bottom of your nav radio display there. When you're in GPS mode, the CDI will still work correctly and still display the correct deviations, and you can still couple it to the autopilot, but that flag will stay up there, which is not correct operation. So if you wanted to operate correctly, you want to go in and create a flight plan, and again, it's a very simple flight plan, just Pine Bluff direct to Stuttgart on your flight plan, and if you do that, then everything, the flag won't pop up and it'll all look correct. Again, it'll work correctly if you don't do that, but if you want it to look correct and not have that nav flag up there as you're shooting the approach and be a little confusing that way, then you do want to load that flight plan. So to actually load the approach, we will go to procedure, we will go to select approach and hit enter. We already have Stuttgart preloaded in here because of our flight plan, and again, if it's not in there, you can go up there and you can change it, but you're going to get that nav flag error. It's already brought us down to this approach field, and it shows us all the approaches, so we'll use the big knob to roll down to RNAV to runway 36. We'll hit enter. It says, how do you want to enter this approach? Where do you want to start? We want to start at Hogum intersection, so we will scroll down to that and hit enter. And then it says load or activate. I want to go direct to Hogum once I depart, so I'm going to go ahead and activate. And that brings that into the flight plan there, so you can see all of our fixes there: Hogum, hold, Laus, Marv, and runway 36. We didn't have the option like we did in the G1000 to, it didn't ask us whether we wanted to do the hold or not, and we do not. We want to do a straight-in approach. So one last step we have to use in the GNS 530 is to push the middle of the small knob to get the cursor active, and then use the big knob to roll down to hold, and then we will hit clear, and we will remove the hold. It asks us, do we want to do that? Yes, we do. Enter, and now we've got the approach going straight on in. So Hogum, Laus, Marv, runway 36, a turn at 474 feet, and then out to Zedek for our missed approach hold. So all of that looks correct. That sets up our GPS correctly. So now we will look at the autopilot. I'll go ahead and bring my altitude of 3000 into the altitude pre-select here. Make sure my heading bug is set up. It is set up for runway heading for runway 36, so we're good there. So that sets up our avionics. Now all we need to do is taxi out and make a departure from runway 36. Also mentioned I can set up my OBS to a course of 055 just to remind myself of about what direction I want to turn if they give me direct once I'm airborne. And if I don't do that, it won't affect the way the CDI operates at all. The CDI is still going to give me accurate guidance, and I can still couple it to the autopilot. But I will get a message down here telling me that I need to set my course to the desired track for this particular leg. So if you don't want that nuisance message, then go ahead and put that in at this time. And then once you reach Hogum, you can turn it to 360 for the inbound course on the approach. With everything loaded, we taxi out to the runway, do our run-up, get our IFR release if we need to, and accomplish our before takeoff checklist. We'll then perform a normal takeoff from runway 36 and climb out initially on runway heading as instructed. So once we get established in a stable climb, we'll go ahead and flip over to departure after departing Pine Bluff and call up departure. They say Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, radar contact, proceed direct to Hogum, resume on navigation, climb maintain 3,000 feet. We acknowledge that and read that back. And so we've got Hogum in there right now. First, I'm going to turn it over to that 055 course to get us pointed over that direction using the heading mode on the autopilot. So about a 055, there it is. Once I do that, I'm going to go ahead and redirect to Hogum. So I hit the direct key. Hogum is already in the field. I hit enter. It says, do you want to activate? I hit enter again. Now my course is centered up, and I can go ahead and activate the nav function on the autopilot. It is now nav tracking, so I'm on my way to Hogum. So now I'm just going to navigate out to Hogum, climb to our cruise altitude of 3,000 feet. Then we'll level off at 3,000 feet, cruise the airplane out, and then prepare for the approach there in Stuttgart. And as we get about 10 miles away from Hogum, ATC calls us back up and they say, Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, you're 10 miles from Hogum, descend to maintain 2,500 feet. Maintain 2,500 feet until established on the approach. You're cleared straight in, RNAV, GPS approach, runway 36 at Stuttgart. So we read all of that back, and now once we hit Hogum, we're authorized to use all of the procedure altitudes on the approach. This time I'm cleared down to 2,500, so I'll go ahead and roll that in the altitude pre-select, and I will engage a vertical speed descent there, so I'll put in about 500 feet per minute. I'll pull the throttle back to keep the speed about 105 knots indicated as I come down the hill, and then we'll level off at 2,500 feet. Once we hit Hogum, we can go down to 1,900 feet, and then it will be time to start to configure for the approach. Once I level at 2,500 and I have a good altitude hold, I can go ahead and stay ahead of the airplane by bringing the next altitude in here. So after I get to Hogum, I want to go down to 1,900 feet, so I'll go ahead and set that in my altitude pre-select at this time. Alright, so we've started the turn at Hogum. Once we get the flip and get the magenta line in front of us there, we'll go ahead and start our descent. And there we have our flip. You notice it's also flipped over to LPV. So I'm going to go ahead and start a vertical speed descent down to 1,900 feet, again using the throttle to keep it on the correct speed. It's automatically going to track this lateral guidance. You notice that with the LPV coming in there, we are now authorized for the approach. We've got good guidance there, and you notice that the vertical flag has gone away, and we're now getting a glide path indication there. So we'll descend on down to 1,900 feet, And then once we're level at 1900 feet, since we've got good vertical guidance, we'll go ahead and arm the approach mode. And then about 3 miles out, we will go ahead and start to configure for the approach. Some other things that I can do is I'm going to go ahead and sync my heading bug up with my actual aircraft heading. That's always good practice. And I can also bring my OBS over to that 360 course for the approach. Again, it's not going to affect how the GPS operates, but it is good operating practice just to have a reminder of what your course is. And again, the courses are just a little bit off on Flight Sim for what they would be in the real world. In the real world, you'd want to check that out and see what's going on there. But in Flight Sim, it is not. It's just a simism. It's still going to fly the approach okay. All right, so we're leveled 3 miles. I'm going to arm the approach mode. If I could find the button, there it is. You can see glide slope is now armed, and we'll go ahead and start configuring for the approach. So I'm going to bring my throttle back to 1800 RPM. We'll do a speed check. Looks like I'm already below 110 knots, so I can go ahead and drop that first notch of flaps. Now I'm waiting for 85 knots to get the rest of the flaps out. All right, there's 85 knots, so I'll bring out 20 degrees of flaps. And then I'll bring out 30 degrees of flaps, and then about 75 knots, I'll go and bring that power back in. It's going to be 22 to 2400 RPM to keep it at 70 knots. So I'm about 1.6 miles from the final approach fix from intercepting that glide path. I want to go ahead and accomplish my before landing checklist. I'd likely get handed off from approach over to the common traffic advisory frequency at this time, so I'd start making my radio calls. But other than that, we're just waiting for that glide path to center up, and then we'll use throttle to keep it centered up as we descend on the approach. And my first sign that I've joined the approach or started tracking the glide path is my VSI headed down. So as the VSI starts to descend, I'm going to go ahead and bring my power back. Again, 1800 to 2000 RPM should keep me on 70 knots as the autopilot tracks the glide slope. So I'm going to ride this glide path down to 74, and about 574, I'm going to take a look outside and see what I have as far as visuals. And again, it's going to hit all of these waypoints. It's going to sequence between Lays to Marv, and then to runway 35. But the vertical path and the lateral path should remain steady for us. As we come down, we'll see the waypoint sequence, but on the LPV approach, we don't need to really worry about that too much. Another thing that I can do is I can set my altitude pre-select so it's in glide slope track now. I'll go ahead and set it for the missed approach, so 2000's coming in here. Before landing check is complete, we're coming up on about 1,000 feet from our minimum, so we'll just monitor the path and the speed, make adjustments as necessary, and then continue on down to that decision altitude to see if we get a visual. So there's about 500 feet from our minimums. We are holding 70 knots. Looks like just a little bit above 1900 RPMs is holding that pretty steady for us. Looks like about 400 feet per minute is keeping us on that glide path. And 360 is keeping us on the track. Everything is looking good. So we'll just keep on tracking down to that decision altitude. And then we'll take a look outside and see if we can get a visual on the runway. All right, so there's about 570. I'll take a look up, and there's our runway and identifier lights and our threshold. I'll kick off that autopilot before I get to the decision altitude, and then I'll just transition to a visual landing. So that is how we fly a LPV approach using the GNS 530 and 430. So to try to judge when you are proficient at these approach, I would use the Airman Certification Standards for precision approaches with this approach, with these types of approaches, even though it is technically a non-precision approach. The terms that they use for the non-precision approaches in the Airman Certification Standards really don't apply to this type of approach because they talk about MDAs, and this approach doesn't have an MDA. It has a decision altitude instead. So I imagine in the real world, more examiners are probably leaning towards using this to judge if you're proficient at the approach than the non-precision language. This can be found in the Airman certifications for the instrument airplane rating. This is Area of Operations 6, Instrument Approaches, Task B, Precision Approaches. The standards are that prior to final approach fix, you should maintain your altitude plus or minus 100 feet, be able to maintain your heading plus or minus 10 degrees, maintain your airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, and then accurately track radials, courses, and bearings. It doesn't give any further guidance as to what it considers accurate, but generally that's considered within 10 degrees or full-scale deflection on a GPS course. And then we're not using an NDB, but generally it's within 10 degrees on an NDB bearing as well. For the final approach fix down to the decision altitude, the standards there are that you maintain a stabilized approach. They're looking for being on your approach airspeed, no excessive airspeed, and no excessive descent rate. And then allow no more than 3/4 scale deflection of the lateral or vertical course guidance. If you get to 3/4 scale and you go missed, rather than trying to continue the approach and accidentally going beyond 3/4 scale, then that is still considered, it's not considered a bust at that point. They will generally allow you to go back and try the approach again. So that's the standard there. If you're actually out there flying the approach, though, technically you're allowed full scale before you should execute the missed approach. Although I would probably tend to execute the missed approach before it gets to that point. You should be able to maintain your approach airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, and then immediately miss the approach at decision altitude if you do not have anything in sight, or transition to a visual landing using a normal rate of descent and normal maneuvering. That concludes this video. Hopefully it's given you the knowledge and skills you need to confidently fly LPV type RNAV GPS approaches using the GNS 530 and 430 on your own. As always, if you've enjoyed the content, please don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell to be alerted to new content, and share the video with your friends. Be sure to tune in for the next video in the series where we'll continue to explore other types of RNAV GPS approaches. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.